All right. Well, good morning to those who are joining us online. We're glad you're here today. Um, it's always nice to be able to still fellowship even when we're in different places. Thankful that you joined us. And we're going to continue in our study of 2 Kings. We are actually in chapter Kings, 2 Kings chapter 5 this morning. First thing I want to talk about is the two prophets who were talked about most in the book of Kings, in the 2 Kings. There's two prophets, and a lot of people confuse them, and I tend to confuse them too myself. One is Elijah. Elijah is the prophet that we know about who was actually taken up by God, never actually died. He's actually taken up into heaven. He was actually the mentor for Elisha. So there's a J and an S, so kind of the differences in their names. He actually kind of mentored under him, and and after Elijah left this earth, then Elisha was his successor, and he kind of carried on what Elijah had been doing in the kingdom at that time. Remember that we are at the time in history where there are the two kingdoms. There's the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and they were at odds quite a bit during this time and had lots of conflicts, and we will study in the past few weeks. This week we're going to talk about it. We're in the point of the time where Elijah is no longer around, and so Elisha is the prophet who is actually the one involved in this story. So just want to make sure we don't confuse who the people are as we're talking about it. That this is not Elijah, the one who was carried up by God directly. This is Elisha, who was actually present at the time Elijah was taken up into heaven. And Elijah promised Elisha that if he was there when he died, when he left this earth, that he'd be passed on the gifts that he had in the service of God. And so he made sure he was always around Elijah, and so he was present at the time. So he did inherit the gifts that God had given Elijah, and God gave Elisha as well. So talk about, how many of you go to the doctor regularly, get regular checkups? For years I didn't, but I do now. But I was always like, yeah, I'm young, I'm healthy, I don't need to go to the doctor. But when you go to the doctor and he says, okay, you're putting on a few too many, which my doctor has said to me this past time. So you need to figure out a way to drop a few pounds. It's going to help your blood pressure. It's going to help your blood sugar levels, all those kind of things that's not bad right now, but they might get bad if you continue on this path. And so I walk out the door, and I was like, okay. And then a day later, I'm back to my old habits. Anybody else feel that kind of had that same thing? It doesn't have to be with the doctors. It can be just advice or just good ideas for anyone. Like, I should really slow down 5 miles per hour when I'm driving. They're probably, maybe going 15 over the speed limit is a little much. Maybe I should just go 9 or 10 over the speed limit. Nothing to say I do that, but it's it's a good idea, but it's really hard to kind of break your habit, break your trend, do things that are not really what you prefer to do. So we all know people who, themselves included, who tend to ignore good advice, no matter where it comes from. Making a change is hard, and a lot of people are just stubborn and set in their ways, and they just don't want to do anything different. They want to continue on the path they're on. It's working fine for me. Nothing's going to happen. But these changes can really help you out in the long run. Like a change in diet could really affect quality of life down the road. So it's really easy to ignore things. It's really easy to want things done our way. And so that's kind of what the story is about this morning. And this is 2 Kings and in chapter 5. I'm going to read the first verse here to start. Naaman, commander of the army for the king of Aram, was a man important to his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was a valiant warrior, but he had a skin disease. So Naaman is a really important person in Aram's kingdom. He's one of his top advisors, one of his top generals. You may also know that Aram better as what is called Syria. And so that's basically Aram was the name for Syria at the time. But that is Syria, the area that he is from. The king probably, they're not certain, but it's probably Ben-Hadad II. And he's mentioned in scriptures in 1 Kings about his wars with King Ahab in the later part of the 1 Kings. So Nahum, it says, was a man who was important to his master, and he was highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. So God, here we already see God is involved here with Aram and in Nahum's life. Of course, they had no idea what was going on because they were not followers in God, in Jehovah God. They were followers in their own God. So we know Naaman was a powerful warrior. He won lots of victories. However, he had a skin disease, and more than likely, that was leprosy, which different times it wasn't really called leprosy in general until kind of closer to Jesus' time when the term leper kind of came into being. So that's probably what he had here was leprosy. And so, of course, what happens when you're a leper? What happens to your community, to people around you? You are shunned. You are put aside somewhere else. You don't come in contact with anyone. So in this case, it doesn't say that he was isolated from the other people, but it probably did make people very afraid of him. Don't want to get near him, even though they have to deal with him because he's a high commander. And of course, he's looking for a way to get a cure for this disease. All right, this is verses 2 through 6 are in here. So I'm gonna go ahead and read the whole section, and then we'll come back and break it down individually. So starting with verse 2, Aram had gone on raids and brought back from the land of Israel, a young girl who served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who was in Samaria, he would cure him of his skin disease." So Naaman went and told his master what the girl from the land of Israel had said. Therefore the king of Aram said, "Go, and I will send a letter with you to the king of Israel." So he went and took with him 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. He brought the letter to the king of Israel and read it. "When this letter comes to you, note that I have sent you my servant Naaman for you to cure him from his skin disease." So it says that Aram had gone on raids in the nearby territories. And so Aram and Israel were not generally friendly with each other. There were times of peace between them, but there were much more times they were in some kind of conflict. Aram had done a few things. He had invaded Israel back in 1 Kings as well, and also Ahab. The word raids is probably kind of small bands of soldiers that went out to do some small objectives, whether it was to see certain areas or to bring back certain things. So probably these raids were like just localized skirmishes, just small little things, not outright full war this time. So on one of the raids, they brought back from Israel a young girl who was a servant to Naaman's wife. So this is the first step in the miracle that God has planned that we're going to read about. Naaman had no idea, again, who Israel's God was. He may have heard of him because of the conflict, but didn't really know him in that way. But the Israelite servant girl who was there did. And so God has placed her in this situation for some purpose, and this is probably the purpose. So she had heard about, or she knew about that Naaman's wife's husband, so Naaman, circular, get back there. She knew about Naaman's issue and that he was seeking out ways to find a cure. And he was desperate to find any way to get rid of this disease. So she speaks to her mistress about the problems that Naaman was having. She spoke apparently confidently and strongly to Naaman's wife. So this is a woman who, even though she's a captive captive in a foreign land, that she is still faithful to her beliefs. So she says, if only my master were with the prophet who was in Samaria, he would cure him of his skin disease. So of course the prophet was Elisha that she was talking about. She knew enough about Elisha to know that he was a man of God and that God was with him and that he had done miracles in the past. We don't know how old she was, but she was certainly old enough to have faith. So it says here, she provides a great example of the childlike faith that Jesus spoke of in Matthew, which is true, because children don't question as much as we do when we get older, and I think that's part of why there's a lot of slipping away for young people when they reach mid-late teens and early 20s, that you see they try other things for a while. It's just, I feel like that they're just, they don't have that childlike faith anymore. They get to a point where they think they know more than those around them. But she was, at this point, she was still had a firm faith. So Naaman's wife came to him and said, the servant girl says, if you go to see Elisha, that he can cure you of this disease. So Naaman went and told the king what the girl had said. It says here that the scenario is kind of unusual, because you wouldn't think an army commander would even have the time of day for a young female slave in his household. It kind of points to the fact that he was probably pretty desperate at this time, that he was willing to try anything to get cured of this disease, because if it was leprosy, that will kill you eventually. It'll continue to eat at your flesh, and you're eventually going to die from it. More than likely, he had prayed to the local gods there, and nothing had happened. We studied about the prophets last time, and how the fire that was sorry, I'm using words here. How Elijah, how he went and built the altars and poured water on his, and God to made it happen there. So he knows that the one true God is the God of Israel, is a God who can perform miracles, but he tries his own God, of course. The same result basically happened in the first time. Nothing happens when he prays to the gods there in their land. So the king, for some reason, says yes. I guess he really, really desperately wanted his top leader, his top military leader, to be cured. So he said, yes, let's go. You can go. He says, go, and I will send a letter with you to the king of Israel. Because you don't just send a big entourage into a foreign land without some sort of clearance or something. Otherwise, it's going to be considered maybe an act of war, or they're going to react to the way they think it's. Because since Aram was such an important person, he didn't come like with 2 or 3 people. He came with basically what you consider a small army that traveled with him. So he says, go, I will send a letter with you to the king of Israel. The letter probably talked about the reason he had sent him, and probably just to say, hey, we're coming. Would you please allow him to come unmolested through the Israeli territory? I mean, I'm sure they had other official visits and things of that nature, but and always it was accompanied by some kind of endorsement from the king. So he came with a large gift. It says there were 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. And that's a pretty hefty sum, to me at least. So that just tells the value that Naaman had to the king, that he wouldn't allow him to take that much with him as a payment for his healing. But when Naaman, even though Naaman knew that it was Elisha that he had been sent to see, he didn't go to see Elisha. He went to the king of Israel. Like I said, probably there's a good reason for that. Probably the protocol is you check in with the king, let him know your intentions, what you're going to be doing, and just kind of get his royal blessing on it so that it's not misinterpreted as something else. The letter said, I have sent you my servant Naaman for you to cure him of his skin disease. So God often uses relationships to bring about his purpose. So here we have Naaman's slave girl giving the right solution for her master who's sick, and the master chose to act on it. So here it says, salvation is about a personal relationship with God through Jesus, his son. And most of us have become believers because someone else introduced us to Jesus. I think that's 99.9% of the time. It is a relationship that leads people to Jesus. It's not them doing something on their own. It's somebody talking to them. Somebody's being in their life who shows them what a life with Jesus is like. So I think that's most likely a very true statement. Salvation is about a personal relationship, and most become believers because someone else helped us to it. When the disciple Andrew first found Jesus, he brought Simon Peter to Jesus. So God can work and does work through believers to accomplish his purpose. All right, I'm going to move on to verse 7 here. All right, when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and asked, am I God, killing and giving life, that this man expects me to cure a man of his skin disease? Recognize that he is only picking a fight with me. So again, Nahum kind of takes the wrong tack as far as how it's approached, because he approaches the king of Israel and says, I'm here for you to cure me of my disease. And so what do you think the king is going to be thinking of that? It's like, I'm not a miracle worker. Why do you come to me for this? And again, he had no idea, except for the letter, of what was going on and why he'd come. So he had no answer for the Syrian king, and he didn't know what to do. So he tore his clothes, which means what? It means really severe distress or really, really anguished. That's when you tear your clothes. There are other examples. You remember Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes when the spies brought back a report and said they couldn't go into Canaan, even though God had told them they could. Paul and Barnabas, they tore their clothes when they realized that the people were worshiping them instead of worshiping the God who they were trying to talk to the people about. So it's a very when you tear your clothes, it's a very distress. It's almost like going into I'm trying to think of a modern equivalent. I don't tear my clothes when I get upset, but I don't know what I do when I get upset. Depression? I don't know. I don't throw things. I don't know. But that was he was very, very distressed by this whole situation. So the king asked them a rhetorical question. He says, am I God, killing and giving life, that this man expects me to cure a man of his skin disease? So the king of Israel knew that he did not have that kind of power. Only God has the power to take life or to restore it. Yet the king of Aram somehow thought that, I guess because he was the king, he's the one who had the power to cure. The king called those and said, he's picking a fight with me. He's trying to antagonize me. He's trying to make something happen. I don't know what his purpose is, but he's trying to cause trouble. So there's got to be some ulterior motive for him to come because they know I can't cure him. In verses 8 through 10, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a message to the king. Why have you torn your clothes? Have him come to me, and he will know there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. Then Elisha sent him a messenger who said, "Go wash 7 times in the Jordan, and you will be restored and you will be clean." So Elisha was in the king's court quite a bit and around quite a bit. We don't know exactly how he learned of what was transpiring with Naaman, but he did find out by some avenue. And he knew that the king Jeroham had torn his clothes, and he was really upset and didn't know what to do. So Elisha sends a message to the king. He says, "Why have you torn your clothes?" We knew Israel's king couldn't cure Naaman, but God's prophet Elisha probably could. Elisha directed the king, "Have him come to me, and he will know there is a prophet in Israel." So Elisha's purpose here, he wanted Naaman, and he also wanted the king, Jeroham, to know that God was the God of Israel. The king listened to Elisha and instructed Naaman to go meet with Elisha. He came with his horses and his chariots, and so, like we said before, we know he had a very large entourage with him, because he was such an important person. He wouldn't never travel alone, and he would need security, and he would need to show that he is very important. So they take off and they go in front of Elisha's house. So Naaman, he's a very important person. But what does Elisha do? He sends out a messenger. He doesn't come himself. He sends a messenger. That probably didn't sit well with Naaman, that I'm this important person and you can't deign to even talk to me yourself. I'm sure he was not accustomed to that kind of treatment, and felt like it was probably a slap in the face, because he was actually the king's man. He met with the king all the time, and yet you're not even giving me the time of day, basically. But Elisha sent this message to Naaman: "Go wash 7 times in the Jordan, and your skin will be restored, and you will be clean." Sounds pretty simple, right? Pretty straightforward instructions, but if he decides to obey these instructions, he has to go to the Jordan, and that was probably about 25 miles away, and not an easy journey either. It was Samaria was like a much higher elevation than the Jordan River. It was almost like almost 2,500 feet difference in elevation. So it was probably not an easy journey to get to the Jordan from there. So Naaman had to decide if he was going to have faith in this instructions to go that far to pursue healing. So as believers, we're often put in this situation that we feel like there should be an easy path to where we're trying to go, but that God makes us go in a roundabout way, or it doesn't give it to us directly. It makes us go through a few things first before we can get to the blessing that He has for us. So we can choose to view these things as opportunities to show God we trust Him, and to show His character. Naaman's slave girl knew the power of God was in Elisha to heal Naaman. The Apostle Paul told the Ephesian church that it was able to do above and beyond all they could ask or think. He said that had this trust in God that if they followed through, that God would lead them and God would take care of it. God displays His power through us when what He does surpasses what we can do. Let's move on to verses 11 and 12. But Naaman got angry and left. Here's his response. "I was telling myself, he will surely come out, stand and call on the name of the Lord, his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the skin disease. Aren't Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be clean? So he turned away and left in a rage. So again, Nahum didn't appreciate, first of all, that Elisha sent a messenger to him instead of coming himself. And Nahum already had figured out how this was going to work. He's going to come out and he's going to stand and call on his God. It's going to be some big public display. It's going to be like almost like a royal ceremony. He expected some amazing demonstration of power rather than a 25-mile trip to a river that he has to dip himself in 7 times. Nahum thought that Elisha would just wave his hand and say, "You're cured," and it would be done. And that would be certainly one way that it could have been done, but that wouldn't show the faith that Nahum had to have. So Nahum also questioned the nature of the directive. He wonders why he should go wash in the Jordan River, because the Abana and the Pharpar rivers were much bigger and cleaner rivers than the Jordan. The Jordan River actually was a slow, or it still is, a slow and very small river. A lot of people, when they go visit, will say, "This is it. This is the Jordan." It's shallow. It's slow moving, and it's not very wide. Yeah, it's like some of the smaller rivers here. I mean, so it's like I got big rivers I can go into. I'm a big guy, so I need a big river. Basically, is what he's saying. People are amazed how small the Jordan is. So Nahum probably was thinking, "Oh my goodness, why would I go there? Couldn't I wash in one of these big rivers that are closer to home and I'll be clean? Why go all the way to the Jordan?" So that means so he turned and he left in a rage. Pride is a really, really powerful thing. Pride gets in the way of a lot of people experiencing God's mercy and God's grace. A lot of times they say the smartest people are the ones that have the hardest time coming to know Christ because they're too smart for their own good, and their pride won't let them accept that someone else can do things for them instead of themselves. But the Bible says what? It says, we have all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. People whose lives are difficult know they need help and may find it easier to turn to Jesus, but successful and righteous people full of pride, find it difficult to believe they might need a Savior from their situation, from their sins. So the final 2 verses in this lesson this morning are verses 13 and 14. But his servants approached and said to him, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more should you do it when he only tells you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So Naaman went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, according to the command of the man of God. Then his skin was restored and became like the skin of a small boy, and he was clean. All right, so it sounds like Nahum had at least some servants who had their stuff together a little bit, because they intervened and didn't let his anger ruin the whole thing for him. They knew how his skin disease was ruining his life, and they knew he'd come a long way to get this done. They saw that his ego was really, really crushed when Elisha didn't come to do it personally. And they saw he was disappointed in what Elisha's directive was, which is to go dip in the Jordan 7 times. So the servants, they recognized that Elisha had given him an answer to his problem. It may not have been the way he wanted it, but he's gotten an answer. He'd gotten a solution. So they addressed him respectfully and said, "My father," which more than likely just a sign of respect for their leader. and asked him, "If the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it?" So yes, the waters of the Jordan aren't as strong as the ones in the Albano or the far rivers. Yet Elisha was a man of God. People knew that. So shouldn't he at least try to follow Elisha's instructions for healing? How much more should you do it when he only tells you, wash and be clean? Sometimes we're just, again, too smart for our own good, or too full of ourselves for our own good, that if it doesn't meet up to our standards of being something great, that it's not going to work. It's not important. If it's not complicated, it can't be the right fix. That we get in our own heads sometimes by doing that. So the servants prevailed, and Nahum went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times. As soon as he obeyed what Elisha had told him to do, what happened? His skin was restored, and he became like the skin of a small boy. He no longer had the features of his disease. His skin was pure looking. He was completely healed, and he was clean. Of course, in the time of Jesus, they had to go show themselves to the priest to have their cleaning verified. And also that prior to that too, actually, in Leviticus it talks about it. But Naaman is actually literally clean. He was cleansed from his disease, and he got his life back. So healing awaits those who obediently follow God's directions, and healing takes many forms. Sometimes he chooses not to bring physical healing in this life. However, he's always compassionate towards us and the people who love him. This is not in our text this morning, but so after this occurs, Elisha refuses any reward for the healing. All that, we talked about how much gold and silver and clothes that he had brought. He refused any of it. But, and so I'm back on the way, but then one of Elisha's servants actually decided he was going to take matters in his own hands, and he went and tracked him down and asked for some of the reward. So he actually got some of the reward and brought it back. And Elisha found out about it and asked him why he had done it. And then as punishment, this servant got leprosy himself. He was given leprosy himself because he had not followed what Elisha had said to do. So Naaman, he thought God's help would be expensive. But he learned it costs nothing to follow God except for your obedience and being faithful to him. So after he's healed, he went back and actually carried back 2 wagon loads of dirt from the spot where he was healed to take back with him to remind him of what had happened. He actually went back into that, which I thought was pretty cool. So God healed Naaman. So was Naaman an Israeli? Was he? No, he wasn't. God heals. God loves all people, and that's the part of this lesson here today is that yes. So Elijah had healed, had raised a boy from the dead earlier, who was an Israeli child, and God gave him the power to do that. But God also gave Elisha the power to heal Naaman, who was not Israeli. So God just doesn't care. Even at this point in time, even before Jesus, God was showing He didn't just care for the Israeli nation. He actually cared for everyone if they would just follow Him. And Jesus is all we need. So so I hope that we get from this lesson this morning that we just need to be to listen to God's directive, even when it doesn't make sense to us, even when it's counter to what we think may be the right thing to do or the way it should be done. That God has the bigger picture, and we have this really, really small piece of it that is probably even that piece is probably cloudy and not correct. And so we just need to trust him and always trust him. And if we follow what he asks us to do and have faith, that he'll deliver us from all kinds of situations in his own way. Does anyone have anything to add for this morning? No? Perry, would you close us in prayer?